Welcome back to the Gurmat Experience, where we explore profound questions at the intersection of science, spirituality, consciousness, mysticism, and the human condition. I'm your host, Sonia Kaur, sitting in dialogue between master and student with world renowned pioneer and expert in psycho spiritual psychology, transpersonal health, mind, consciousness, contemplative practices, and overall master in endless ocean of divine wisdom, the one and only Davinder Singh Panesar. Welcome back.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji
Waheguru
Ki
Ki
Fateh.
Fateh.
Thank you very much for inviting me back and allowing us to have this dialogue.
I mean, this dialogue is essential in today's very, I would say, lost world. People are searching for meaning, purpose, understanding, and compassion in their own suffering, which takes us to today's podcast. And we're going to confront one of life's most challenging realities, the nature of suffering.
Ooh,
Dukh, suffering, sukh or joy. Basically, why do we suffer?
right. I think, again, we always begin with our definitions, Son. So let's identify what do we mean by suffering, right? So there is pain. Say you break your leg or you have a headache. Um, this can be defined as pain, but not necessarily as suffering. So, suffering is the psychological component. So, suffering is when you, say, for example, have a pain and you keep, ruminating about the pain. Oh, I wish I didn't have that pain. I wish this pain would go away. Why do I feel like this? Why does it always happen to me? That internal dialogue, we can call that a suffering. So, suffering is the psychological, internal experience that we have. Now, suffering comes in many, many different ways, right? We can have suffering where we are separated from something. We have suffering where we lose something. We have suffering in death. We have suffering in love. When you love someone enough and have that kind of deep emotional connection, um, in their absence, you feel suffering. So, suffering is the absolute necessity, but also baked in the cake. Why is it baked in the cake? Because we live in an experience that's dualistic. So we have suffering, dukh, and the absence of suffering, sukh. Pleasure is something different. And I think we need to identify the definitions so we can have a meaningful dialogue. Suffering is the presence of discord, distress, and I would say disharmony and incoherence within yourself, whereas sukh is the absence of
Wow. So you're touching on this universal nature of suffering, and that dukh is not just a personal pain, but a universal condition. And this condition is dualistic. This condition is constantly grasping for pleasure or joy or not to feel pain.
that. Sure.
And that's the nature of the human condition, the human mind, the egoic complex. So you touched on the other side of dukh, which is sukh.
Mm.
How would you define that?
So sukh is the absence of dukh, right? Well, easiest way to look at this, you have say right now you have a toothache, and you can define that as, look, you know what, I am suffering from a pain, yeah, but right this moment, for example, you may not be experiencing any of that pain. So therefore, there is an absence of it. We only notice pain. We do not notice the absence of pain. So pain is intrinsically linked to, well, our survival space for sure, but more importantly, suffering in particular, dukh daru sukh rog pya, suffering in particular is the challenge that allows the opportunity for you to transcend. So suffering becomes your medicine. So suffering becomes our medicine when our lifestyle becomes our illness or our disease. And it is only through suffering that we begin to become focused. And you will notice that in suffering, time slows down. You will notice that when you are not suffering, You don't tend to notice the flow of time. But when you're in a state of suffering, or when you're in a state of emotional or psychological distress, then you will find the time tends to slow down. So suffering becomes our medicine, meaning it becomes our medicine because it draws your focus to something. And through the drawing of your focus towards that particular aspect, you discover the nature of your suffering. And through them discovering the nature of your suffering, you transcend. Now, the remarkable thing is, do you suffer if you don't have an ego? And you will realize that all suffering, all dukh and sukh is man ki birtha, meaning it is the condition of your mind. So it is the egoic complex which then adds this component of sukh and dukh to our life experience.
And you're shifting the lens here, and we're seeing that suffering, the very nature of suffering, is a teacher, and that this suffering isn't necessarily an obstacle, but this kind of pathway that connects us all. Why is this so? Why does this universality tell us? What does this universality of suffering tell us about our existence?
Well, look, again, it is our attachment to our experience which will determine the intensity of our suffering. So, if we were to look at, for example, lived examples of the tradition of the Sikh tradition, and what Guru Arjan Dev Ji had to endure, what Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji had to endure, what Guru Gobind Singh Ji had to endure, the Sahibzade, etc. It demonstrates to you that the way we perceived suffering in our everyday life is something that can be transcended. And how can we transcend it? It is transcended through the transcending of our egoic space. Because all suffering, the roots of all suffering are attachment. Our attachment, our egoic attachment to anything. It could be a belief system. It could be our body. It could be our relationships. When those are compromised, or those are in any way brought to a place where they are challenged, then we experience suffering. So let's describe suffering in the exact terms that it is. Suffering is wanting things to be different than they are. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of suffering. Mm-hmm. If you want things to be different than they are, then that will provide you with emotional or psychological distress.
Wow. So what you're saying is that Gurmat teaches us that suffering can awaken us to these deeper truths, and our masters and spiritual guides that have come before us, their very journey has taught us that these trials faced by countless seekers find transformation in their pain. And this very suffering, when embraced, can lead to a sense of spiritual awakening.
Yeah. You see, the thing is, normally when we encounter suffering, the natural reaction due to our Klesh cycle, which you will know about if you did Gurmat therapy, this intrinsic kind
Gurmat therapy 6 starting in March 2025.
Yeah, this intrinsic capacity that we inherent from our reincarnation, our kind of previous space, and we build upon it in this life. You will notice that the egoic activities are based on attraction and aversion. It runs towards that which gives it security and safety, and it runs away from that which gives it any sense of suffering or the nature of suffering, or brings it close to anything that it feels will threaten its survival. And normally it tends to be your egoic survival, right? That we tend to work, we tend to fluctuate between suffering and non-suffering, suffering and non-suffering. So, as a human component, we have within our kind of psychological space, let me give you 5 components, right? Number 1 is ignorance. The fact that we are completely ignorant about who we are, what life is, what reality is, and most importantly, ignorant about death, dying, and post-life, right? So ignorance about ourselves, ignorance about life is our basic blindfold. As a result of this ignorance, we tend to identify and accumulate our identity within our psychological space or our conditioned space, which we will call our home, our egoic complex, etc. This egoic complex then is on a default self-preservation setting. So it's always trying to protect itself. And as a result of these three things, number one, ignorance. Number two, the egoic complex, the conditioned self. And number three, the fact that it's on a default setting of self preservation means that this egoic entity will always be seeking that which gives it security and safety and always be running away from suffering. The reason I needed to provide that explanation was to give you the approach to suffering. So rather than running away from suffering, if we were to begin to look at it, right? And what does that mean? That means first to accept things for the way they are. Stage number one. Accept things for the way they are. Stage number two is to recognize that you always have choices. You always have choices. Either you run away from this and it perpetuates the same cycle, or you begin to notice what's going on. And what we tend to do is we tend to then look at how does this state of suffering manifest within us. And it will manifest within you in three different ways. Thoughts, the story you're telling yourself, the emotion those thoughts then create, and that depends on how much you believe that story, and the sensation where in your body it manifests. So these three components are interdependent, but it all begins with your storytelling, which then gives rise to your corresponding emotion, which is then experienced as suffering or non-suffering.
Wow. So basically, don't believe everything the mind tells you.
That's the truth of it, because ultimately, I mean, just look at the COVID crisis. Um, the way the propaganda channels were working, it had entirely everyone in a state of panic and suffering. And the suffering was out of fear. So we then need to look at what do we mean by suffering? How does suffering actually manifest? So suffering manifests in many different ways. Suffering can manifest as laughter. You know, when you are uncontrollably laughing, it becomes so uncomfortable. Yeah. Suffering can manifest in different ways in different places. For example, someone's had a loss and they go into a total meltdown. But what they notice is out of the meltdown comes out of, from the suffering comes non-suffering. So the other thing to recognize is, and I'm so sorry I didn't mention this earlier on, is suffering and non-suffering are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other, right? This is intrinsically baked in your life. So in our, particularly the kind of, the Western world view, we tend to avoid suffering. We're always running away from suffering. We're always moving towards success. We don't like failure. We want health. We don't want unhealth space. We want non-suffering. We don't want to acknowledge suffering. We want to live. We don't want to face death. We want success. We don't want to look at failure. Why? It's looking at one side of the coin. And when you're looking at the one side of the coin, so people are always seeking happiness. The very act of seeking happiness is actually saying to ourselves that we are not content in the space that we are in, and there is this existential suffering of non-acceptance.
Mm. So there's a powerful role of acceptance in moving through suffering and aligning into a space where essentially we walk through the suffering to walk towards freedom. So I want to start speaking a little bit about the opposite of suffering, non-suffering, okay, and what I would think Gurmat defines as sukh. Why does this illusion of sukh, why does it feel so temporary? Like in chasing joy, we often cling to things that are impermanent, right? Possessions, relationships, achievement, etc. And this attachment creates the very dukkha we wish to avoid. Why does it feel so temporary?
Because it is temporary. All phenomena has a start, middle, end. all attachments have a start, middle, end. So it is temporary because this is the nature of existence. And by chasing one, we negate the other, or we think we're negating the other, but the reality is out of sukh comes dukh, out of dukh comes sukh. Yeah. One gives birth to the other. So let me give you an example. So you have a fabulous new, let me make it current and contemporary, fabulous new mobile phone that makes you very, very content in having whatever that experience it gives you. And then you lose it. It is the very loss of the very thing that brought you joy that brings you suffering. The similar, we can make it personal, things are not going your way, you haven't got a job, so you suffer anguish. And then out of the anguish, as soon as you have a job, the anguish turns to sukh. So sukh and dukh are two interrelated, but each gives birth to the other. You cannot have one without the other. So running after sukh, according to Gurmat, is actually asking for dukh.
Yeah, it's a relationship, and this relationship is something that is nothing to do with us. It's the nature of the mind and the ego itself, and the way that it plays. I think that you're reminding us that suffering is not a punishment. It's an opportunity to awaken, to grow, and essentially it disrupts all the illusions that we hold.
Perfectly, perfectly articulated that, Sonia. It's the catalyst that breaks the illusion. And the reality is that we try and live in this very mollycoddled world, and particularly the generations that we are currently, growing up. They are so mollycoddled in terms of so many different things that suffering is a necessity part of your growth development, and therefore preventing access to just regular suffering, falling down, riding a bike, those kind of little minor things, actually makes you extremely sensitive to the minutest little disruption, which makes you socially and in many other ways actually malfunction or dysfunction.
Wow. All I can say is blown away as usual. Thank you, Davji, for sharing just a drop of the ocean of wisdom that you hold. And to the listeners, I know that it's quite a lot to take in, but at the same time, this is why we're here. Today, we explored the nature of suffering, dog suck, and the interconnectedness and their role in guiding us towards understanding this essential human condition. And we've got to remember that suffering is not the enemy. It's the medicine that heals the deeper wounds of attachment and the egoic complex, which we're born with, but we're learning to transcend. And Goodmat therapy offers a very powerful pathway, methodology, and framework out of that. So thank you, Davji. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, Sonia.
Amazing. So, listeners, we'll see you next time, hopefully, and allow yourself to reflect on those deeper questions this time. Stay curious, stay present, and we'll see you then. Take care.
Waheguru Ji Ka
Khalsa,
Khalsa,
Vaheguru
Waheguru
Ji
Ji
Ki
Ki
Fateh.
Fateh.